Alaikum. It's so nice to have you guys here on a Sunday, Ramzan Mubarak. So excited to moderate this session with a new friend, Yousuf Khan, who is quite amazing. And even me doing my research into him, I've already gotten to speak to him a few times. But was really excited as I dug in of all the questions that I would like to ask him and of all the things that I'm sure you'll be asking him today too. So obviously most people on this group have been part of the Bach Launch channel. So you guys know that these Sunday chats happen for about an hour. So feel free to chat in questions as you have them. But I'm excited to welcome Yousuf here today. So welcome, Yousuf.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm glad to have reconnected with a friend and a new one. So thank you so much. Yeah.
And so Yousuf, for those who don't know, obviously he's a partner at Ridge Ventures, but prior to that has had about over 20 years of operator experience, specifically as a CIO of a number of companies. But before we discuss kind of the professional work thing, Yousuf, for me, I think your background is actually so interesting and what led you to kind of, even coming to the Bay Area, becoming a CIO, all of that. So we'd love for you to maybe share with the audience just your background, where you grew up, like what led you to kind of get into this space?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, thanks to Ali and the Bach Launch team, I think, or Bach Launch team of Ali, I guess, for creating this platform. And I couldn't be more excited to basically be here. Yeah, look, ultimately, I may be a VC and an operator for 20. Ultimately, I'm just a kid who was born in Karachi who's trying to make it in the world. So I'm just, that's probably the easiest way to kind of start. I've lived all over the world. I'm not sure what my parents were thinking, if I'm perfectly candid, but the reason that's important is a lot of us have from a Pakistani diaspora standpoint, have had experiences, but have a strong connected base back to Pakistan, as do I. And, I basically have kind of lived all over the world, grew up the world, and spent a lot of time in the UK at university. And life basically has a very interesting way of putting you in a place where you didn't really intend it. And so your plans are never certain. So I don't tend to plan as effectively as I do. I started my career accidentally on purpose working at a tech startup. The company was moving boxes into a new office, and they needed someone to help them move boxes. And that's how my technology career actually started. I overheard a conversation, and in my Pakistani fortuitous industrious kind of altruism said, well, you should speak to this person and do this. And they're like, wow, this guy seems very, very helpful. And that kind of fast forwarded my career in working into technology for 20 plus years. I was lucky because my first job in technology was working for a CTO, and working directly for him for an internet startup allowed me to get a vantage point across all aspects of technology, from applications and infrastructure, security to databases. I'm intellectually very, very curious from that vantage point. And as a result, had just continued to basically build a career in consulting. But I've always worked with technology startups in some way, shape, or form. And the reason is very simple. Company building is a very, very hard thing. And as a result of that, I was always enamored with venture capital because I think it genuinely benefits society by being able to invest in early stage businesses, which typically would not be investable, number one, in traditional financing terms. And the second is to be able to, for those companies to have an impact, not just on their technology or the solution they're building, but be able to employ and to be able to build companies and actually have a positive impact for the community. So that was from an aspirational standpoint. I never knew I would actually get there. Fast forward about 7 years ago, I basically had left a job in the UK, came to the Bay Area because I on a week's visit, and I basically had tried to meet everyone I knew, and I just emailed everyone I knew and said, I'm going to be here, and I'd love to basically get 30 minutes of your time just to let you know what I'm up to, and would love to get some ideas about what I would like to do. And one thing led to other. I basically met with the CEO of a company called Qualys, who was very kind to, after 45 minutes or so, wanted me to meet with members of the executive team and allowed me to say, well, we'd love for you to consider a CIO role here. And that precipitated my move to the San Francisco Bay Area. Since then, I've held a number of CIO roles where I've basically always been the very first CIO for a company. And the reason for that is because most companies, get to a stage of things are breaking, trying to things figure out. And then they kind of look at me, they're like, Yousuf Ahmed Khan, one in Pakistan's kind of go all over the place, weird accent, weird name. How much damage can he really do? Why don't we just hire him and kind of bring him in place? And so I became the CIO for a company called Pure Storage, which is an amazing company, and it changed my life and changed my career. Helped it scale from about several hundred employees to several thousand, and through an IPO and over $1 billion in revenue and go to market and all those other things. And during that time, I've always been involved with startups, early stages, giving them advice, giving them guidance. They reach out to me, and I'd always wanted to be in venture. And so as I worked at a startup for 18 months, helping scale, I enjoyed that experience, but ultimately I knew I wanted to do that at a much larger scale. And then decided that it was time for me to basically do so. And so Ridge Ventures, I joined last year. I've been with the firm for about just under a year, and so far so good. It's definitely probably optimizing for fulfillment, if I may be perfectly honest, because I think most people should do that in their career as much as they can do, or at least optimize for that. So that's a quick background.
Well, let's get deeper into it. And actually what I always find interesting, actually the first time that we met, I really identified with the fact that you and I both kind of have this third culture kid experience, right? Where we've kind of sound a certain way, but haven't really grown up in any one place. And so that in not being able to place us, I think it automatically means that you can kind of fit in anywhere. Has that been kind of your experience as like a fellow TCK?
Yeah. I think, look, like I said, I think we're just all trying to make it in the world, if I'm perfectly honest. And venture is one of those places where you don't actually know whether you're going to do well until a few years, and so I think that's kind of important. So yeah, story of my life, if I'm perfectly honest. I think it's my biggest advice I give. I mentor a number of people, CIOs, both also VPs of IT, and lots of women in technology as well. And one of the things I strongly advise is you have to basically try and aim to work to go where you're most needed and go where you feel most appreciated, because that will at least optimize you in terms of the place you want to be. And I think the second thing is, ultimately, if you are passionate about something, success typically follows. And I've been deeply passionate about working in venture. I've been deeply passionate about working with startups in early stages. And that has kind of driven my ambition to basically aim to be in a particular place. Yeah. So still from finding myself, very much so.
And so quick question, because you often say that you tend to be the company's first CIO. So at what point, and this is really interesting for those of us operating in Pakistan specifically, at what point does the company need a CIO? Like, what is that inflection point that someone like you comes in?
Yeah. So it's a very, very good question. Typically, the chief information officer is going to be hired when the level of technology that the company is basically buying, or at least building, but even has bought, is not connecting and is not scaling. Number one. Number two is it's when you start to have issues across, when it may be like several hundred employees, or even sometimes some companies hire too late, in my viewpoint. And the reason is that you have a bad employee experience. And so that's when companies come to the realization that somebody needs to own the employee experience when it comes to technology. For example, you get hired into a company, you have to be productive. And if you have to spend weeks on time, it sounds so basic, right? But if you think about it, if you have to spend like hours, weeks on time trying to figure out, like, can I connect to this? How do I do this, etc.? It's a complete waste of time, right? And so just at the very fourth thing, like if an IT organization can just provide a very good service for employees to be productive, that's a key way to do it. But they need leadership for them to be able to do that. And I think that's really, really important. In some cases, I was hired right after an IPO, right before an IPO, where people are like, okay, we need to be compliant, but we also need to be able to make sure that things are in order, and somebody needs to be able to drive it. So those are the other reasons that—
And build the infrastructure, right? That's necessary.
Build the infrastructure. That's exactly right. Yeah, totally.
So what's interesting, I was kind of going through like your roster of the many places that you've been a CIO. It's really diverse, right? I mean, obviously like B2B enterprise, but then there's all sorts of verticals that you've worked in. For you, like, what's the through line? Like what I've experienced, and Misbah and I were really lucky recently. Yousuf actually did a really great session for our portfolio companies. And I noticed right away that he, like, one of our companies, it was just like, was a problem he wanted to solve. And so he kind of was like, we're going to talk offline about this. We're going to fix this problem. For you, like, what are the things that inspire you to work at a certain company because they've been so diverse? Has there been a through line in terms of that experience?
Yeah. So the through line has been really about spaces which I've been very interested in, number one. Number two, I've only ever worked for a company where I generally really appreciate and kind of believe in the product. It's not always correct. I mean, sometimes, we all make our mistakes. Let's be perfectly candid. But, if you have interest in a particular industry, in my case, it was, infrastructure. It was started because I believe that that's kind of where things are going. That's kind of important. I think the other through line, honestly speaking, I think this sounds really basic, is culture. You really just want to work with a place where you are appreciated, where you are respected. And I think, one of the advice I give to all of the CEOs and founders that I basically work with is, build a company that you want to basically be proud of, right? Just think of it from that vantage point. I'm genuinely proud of working for Ridge Ventures. I think it's a good firm. I think it's a good set of people. Did I have the opportunity to work with other firms? Sure. Yes, those opportunities did exist. But I sort of felt more closely associated with a group of people that I probably worked better with and more aligned with. So that was the other common thread, was really about culture. I think the fourth thing, which really is just about, where you're going to be most impactful. A lot of us basically will take it, and it's not a criticism at all, but I just believe that life is very, very short, that you should not, live your life in regret. If the world has taught us anything over the last last year or so, you should prioritize your time accordingly and don't do would, could, and should if you have the ability to do it. Not everybody is lucky as me and others. I will take that. We completely say that. But ultimately, what you're saying is go where you're most needed. And I think I was most needed in the companies that I basically with. And I think if you spoke to the people in all seriousness who've either worked for me, I think some of them will say I'm a good boss, but the people who basically hired me, they'll say, yes, we needed a Yousuf Khan at that time. And that's why I joined. When it didn't work out, or I didn't think it was the right place, then I had to make a decision. And that was the decision that I basically made. But ultimately, that was the thing that kind of drew me. Like, am I going to be respected? Am I going to add value? Am I going to come out of there knowing that I had pride in my work? These are the things that kind of guided me throughout my career.
Very cool. And I mean, for you, I think when we first spoke before, you talked about, you kind of had always wanted to get into the VC space, but you kind of you built like a strong operator background of over 20 years. So why now? Like, why did you decide that now was the time that you wanted to be in the VC space?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I was monumental levels of low self-esteem, fear of failure, concerns about whether I'm going to be good at it. Yeah. All of those things. I mean, just, it's an absolute barrage of some of the things I've had to basically go through from that standpoint. So one of the things that just stopped me is just pure fear of failure and insecurity. But I think the other thing that I tried to get into venture very early on in my career, and I was dejected a little bit as a result of like people saying, very nice things, very typical British way, just like, well, that's really encouraging application, but, don't have time for it, right? So I went through that process early on, and I kind of, I had a philosophy. My philosophy is very simple. I ultimately believe that and that's why I encourage operators to go into venture, is because I think we've understood how companies are built. We understand buying or building software. And then you need to understand the nuances, the 10,000 nuances of venture, and see whether you can apply those. So I built a career over operating. I never knew I would end up in venture eventually, by the way. Just to be clear, that realization came only last year when I actually said, I'm actually going to go for it because I just want to go for it. But for a long time, I was playing on the sidelines, and there's only so long you can ever be on the sidelines. In my viewpoint, you have to be kind of in the arena and kind of leaning in. And from my vantage point, it was the fact that I'd advised hundreds of startups. So Saturday and Sunday mornings for the last 5 years, if you are a startup and you wanted feedback and background and guidance, you could easily call me and message me. And I would happily basically either you buy me a cup of coffee or I will happily buy you a cup of coffee and I'd happily give you feedback. That is literally what I did. As a result of that, when I came into venture, there was just lots of founders who had known me, who had said some positive things, hopefully. And as a result of that basically helped me, do a little bit more in the venture space. It's still very early, been here less than a year, but that was a large part of it. So it was just getting to a stage of realization that you really want to do something, and perhaps the opportunity is now. So yeah.
And so I think it was August of 2020 when you announced that you were going to be joining Ridge. You've been part of their CIO network or CXO network before, correct? Was that how you got introduced to them?
Yeah. So, look, I was the first customer of several companies when I was CIO of Pure Storage. One of the things I used to do, and most people don't realize this. So if you are listening, if you're building an enterprise startup, understand that you're more needed in enterprise companies than actually most people laid on. Most people don't go after that market, go after speaking to CIOs as much as I believe they should. And VPs of ITs and IT directors. So when I was CIO of Pure Storage, when I was CIO of Qualys, I was meeting with startups all the time. The reason is very simple. I can't do anything creative as a CIO at scale and do it quickly. I can't hire a software engineer in the Bay Area to work for me. I mean, no offense, I barely want to work for me, let alone try to convince other people to work for me. So with that regard, I would meet with startups who are solving a problem that I cared about. And as a result, I would basically say, well, I'd love to be your first customer, or I'd like to be an early customer. For example, Slack, I was a customer in 2015. Zoom, I was an early customer in 2015. I was just going to say,
weren't you an early customer of Zoom? Yeah.
Yeah, earliest customer of Zoom, early customer of Slack, first customer of Moveworks, first customer of Simpler. There's a ton of companies where I was the early customer of. The reason I'm basically mentioning that as background is, as a result, a lot of VCs who had either invested or thinking about investing would find out that I was the crazy guy who was basically the first customer and the product actually worked. And so as a result, a number of VCs got to know me over time. I joke that I'm the glorified unpaid intern at about 50 different VC firms because I've helped them with diligence and referencing and et cetera. So those relationships start to develop over time without any transactional value. And ultimately what happened was Ridge was one of those where they said, Alex and Brendan were like, you should be part of our CIO council. The CIO council has been around for about a decade. People I knew. So I used to turn up 3 or 4 times a year, give feedback on companies. And that basically established a relationship with Ridge over time. And, I just worked with a great set of human beings. They've been very, very experienced. We complement each other from a skill standpoint. And so then it was just about choosing the right stage, which is late seed and Series A, which is where I want to go. B2B software, which is kind of my focus, and that's kind of where I've operated. And then working with a firm where, the check sizes are right, but also the people are good, where you can add most value. And that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, I could see that even in the way they described your announcement. It was so playful in terms of calling you the Sultan of sweater vests and like helper in chief. And so that in itself spoke volumes about the culture at Ridge, I think, too.
Yeah. So, look, there's a slight personal story about the sweater vest. It's a memory of someone who's very close to me, and so I've worn that ever since that person passed away. So that's actually origination of it, and so it allows me to both reflect about that person's impact in my life, but also
honor them.
Honor them to a certain extent. I think that's a key part, but. The joking side is very simple. I moved to the Bay Area, as you can see. I like collared shirt. I'm old school. Trying to basically wear shoes and socks coming in. And you come to the Bay Area and tech, and it's a interesting set of kind of fashions that are there. So I just thought the easy middle ground is to dress like a librarian with a sweater vest, and hopefully. The other thing is, you don't get mad at people wearing sweater vests if you think about it. Just like a guy with walks up to you like, can you really get mad at him? You can't really, because it says, my God, the guy should be, guy's probably came out of the library. Why would I be mad at him? So if you're a CIO, if you're in the IT organization, people get mad at you all the time. Wi-Fi is not working, Zoom's down. People blame you for a lot of stuff. So it kind of it's a very diffusing of tension type effect.
It's a very Ned Flanders type of approach to things.
Yeah, so I've never been called Ned Flanders, Kalsoom, but
that was the first thing I thought of. I was like, "Ooh, Ned Flanders."
I appreciate that was the first thing you thought of after my 20-year Korean venture that you referred to Ned Flanders, Kalsoom. Thank you.
The Heidely Ho neighbor, like here to fix your stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you've really upped the scene on Sunday morning. Thank you very much.
I thought you'd appreciate that. We have a question in here from Nabil saying that wearing your CIO hat, how do you think the remote is going to pan out in the coming years? And if the companies are remote ready? From a VC vantage point, what's your take on startups trying to solve that problem?
Okay, so fundamentally, remote has been now established as something which is going to be a standard part of operation for companies, but companies are completely mixed on what that strategy is. I'll give you a quick joke. There's literally millions of people before March 2020 who have basically been working from home for literally years. And honestly, I think they were laughing their heads off when all of this COVID hit, and there's all of these, how do you work from home, and how do you do the setup, and how do you deal with this? And they were like, we've been doing this for years. What are you guys up to, right? And I'm sure they found it kind of hilarious. And I think what's important is that I think people are more comfortable with it than ever before, number one. But honestly speaking, I think it's going to really come down to a bunch of companies which feel that this is the right thing for them. I am a much more in-office individual. I think the collaboration and building a venture firm requires that to happen because the exchange of ideas need to be fluid. I don't want to book someone's time to be able to do that. I want to be able to have it ad hoc where I basically can. Those are one of the benefits to it. Let's go to the question about the actual startups. I think that the technology landscape ultimately requires a bunch of different areas to be fixed around remote working. First and foremost is around security. The security landscape ultimately has changed because now you've got everything from compliance issues. I mean, call center workers using, PII-based information from home. Like, how do you secure that? How do you make sure that that is secure on a home circuit, right? Monitoring in some cases of endpoints because you're connected to a network which may not be secure. The performance of the application in a remote environment which hasn't been built before. That's important, basically. And then, the collaboration that you need to be able to put together. So those are the things that are typically going to be, and from a CIO vantage point, as well as a venture standpoint, that's what I've typically seen. So I think there's some companies which are going to, are coming to focus on this, on each of those different areas. It's very early to tell which one of those are going to basically break out, right? I think that's the key thing. So Zoom, for example, just announced $100 million Zoom fund, right? Which basically, so as a result, clearly what's happening now is that there are startups who have accepted that there are millions of people who are going to be continuing to run their lives on Zoom, and totally businesses as well. We need to be able to build a much better application ready for that organization or that type of vertical. And so that's going to happen a lot more, whether it's education or commerce or otherwise. So you're going to start to see a lot more of this come about simply because the capital is being deployed towards it and that there's a basically need that sort of comes from that vantage point.
Those are really important considerations for people to think about and startups themselves. What I'm curious about too is that, let's also think about, I know from a perspective of how you've helped startups, you've worked with a lot of founders from Pakistan as well, and you've been looking at the market. Obviously, you've been operating in Silicon Valley for a really long time. What's your perspective on what's, the Pakistan startup ecosystem and how that's been evolving?
Yeah, actually, so fun fact, I've actually invested in and helped build a business in Pakistan. So I actually did that best part of a decade ago. So, and still stay very, very connected as much as I can. Part of the thing about moving to venture was to try and basically see, because we can invest outside the US and we were able to do that. So it's about finding the right opportunities to be able to do it and go about diligence, etc. I think the ecosystem has definitely really evolved, and I'm excited by it. I think work that you're doing at I2I is huge. I think and the number of the capital that's being deployed now is actually good. It's still not enough. I think more has to be done. I have to play a part in that in the way that I basically can. My part to play on that is basically I can advise as many, or at least give guidance to as many startups as possible. I want to be plugged into the ecosystem. So my plan is that when I can safely visit, I'll be able to basically do so. I think the things that are required. So I'm, for example, speaking to one of your portfolio companies, which I intend to basically help. Part of it is I just got to solve this problem. It's mad.
Yes.
The infrastructure around startups is what needs to be built up. And so the ecosystem, a startup ecosystem in the UK, by the way, just so we're clear, I lived in the UK for 20 plus years until moving to there in 2014. The startup ecosystem was not really there. I mean, it took a long time. It took a long time to get into a place of fruition. Now it's kind of fintech capital of the world, but it took a long time to get there. I still speak to lots of businesses in Europe where the valuations are super low, or the ambitions of the founders are not really well calibrated, at least from my vantage point. So I think the still thing is very, very early. What I have seen is that there's an equalization of each of these centers, right? Where you're starting to see the level of activity in Pakistan increase on a pretty much rapid basis, the number of capital that's being deployed out. So I think the objective is that the more infrastructure that can be built to be able to support it, either finance or technology or otherwise, I think that's going to be a critical piece to be able to uplift that environment. And so, my hope is that going forward, one of the things I'd say is, for what it's worth, the one thing about us Pakistanis, we just don't give up very easily. And there's a sense of pride that you basically, we have to figure out a way to be able to go towards. If you think about the shape of the country and what we've had to go through over time, it's been, you take a little bit of a step back, you're like, whoa. But we've kind of been able to sort of work our way through it. It's hard, but I think we'll do it. So I remain hopeful and optimistic. And I think I would love to be able to play a part in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it's so interesting as someone, I mean, I've been an operator in the ecosystem in Pakistan for 10 years now. And it's fascinating to see how much has proliferated in the last 2 years, right? So we've tracked that startups have raised over $200 million since 2015, but more than half of that has now been in the last 18 months, right? And, obviously Cheat Day announced their Series B like this past week. And then, Baikia was last year. We know so many companies that are raising a Series B and Series A right now, which didn't happen before. And so it's super interesting because I think we had a lot of barriers to growth, which is, your sweet spot. It's where you sit. So just curious in terms of you're obviously speaking to, you've invested in companies before in Pakistan. You've obviously worked with a lot of companies. For you, what would be the biggest advice in terms of, because for me as an investor that operates at seed, we're trying to get companies to a Series A and then hopefully, and then beyond that, right? And so what would be your biggest words of advice for startups in Pakistan that are thinking about those inflection points for growth?
Yeah, so I've got a ton of points, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Okay. First and foremost is speak to Kalsoom and Misbah. Like, they're just great.
Thank
that
you.
should be at the top of your list. It really doesn't matter stage, whatever. Like, and I say that in deliberation, not because you are fundamentally awesome. So I just want to say
Thank
that.
Thank you. I'll give you a tip after. Thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. More importantly, you have to be part of the ecosystem. Okay, which basically means you have to be able to do the level of outreach you need. That's just how entrepreneurs work. So, that happens in the UK, it happens in Europe, it happens in the US, Midwest, Bay Area, otherwise. You have to be able to make sure you're part of the ecosystem. That is part of the job. So the biggest advice I would give is make sure you are part of the community, you're able to implement the community accordingly. Number 3, I give this as a kind of a rallying cry. We are in it together is a much better strategy than I'm in it alone. Yeah. Okay. It's just another day in the software business. That's the way I look at it. So what that basically means is if you are able to help another founder with advice or guidance, ultimately everybody wins as a result of it. In some case, most of the companies that you meet with they're not competition. They are not competition. Okay. And so my strongest advice is the stronger that you can build a community, the better you're able to basically get everyone to win as a result of it, all in good time. And that's been the biggest thing that has broken, unfortunately, us in a number of different sectors. We haven't thought about it from a collective vantage point. Just do me all a favor. Number 4 is just don't worry about the agendas. Seriously, it's just another day in the technology business. We're just all trying to make it in the world. Like, life is very short. Try and make sure that you can help people along the way, and other people will help you along the way. And if they don't, fine, just move on, right? At least you did your bit. Number 5, and probably first and foremost, be very, very focused about your milestones and your goals, okay? You can try and basically attract venture capital in one cases, but ultimately, if you have self-belief, try and basically structure it in the best way you can. That basically means having a rigor in your product roadmap, whatever you can achieve and how you want to basically go about doing this. Number 6, you're going to make mistakes. Just understand and accept that you're going to make mistakes. You have to learn from those mistakes. You have to iterate. So if you actually accept, before you start a company or even when you're starting a company, just say, I'm going to allow myself to make 5 big mistakes. Then you'll be fine. Just understand that you take that, like most founders, by the way, are doing things which are completely unnatural. They have to wake up and they have to say, I'm going to go after $1 billion opportunity. I'm not that brave. So if you're an entrepreneur, there's a reason why I help out founders. So connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email, Kalsoom knows, I'll spend time on weekends, no problem, done, right? But the point I'm basically making is, like, you're doing something very unnatural, you're going to make mistakes. You have to accept those, you have to figure out how to be able to work through those. Probably advice number 7 is, right, just go after a big opportunity. You have to do that. That's how you build an investable business. So when you actually put things together, understand the market need and know that you're able to basically go towards being able to achieve that. Smaller ambitions are not going to be investable ideas. It's just the harsh reality of where venture is. And so if you're able to look at a market that basically works well, that's important. Final piece of advice, partner well. Okay. Partner with investors, partner with, financiers, with angel investors, partner with employees and vendors. Like that's how successful companies are built. You want to figure out how companies were built over the last few years. The world did not need another video conferencing software in 2011. Zoom came about because they built a phenomenally much better user experience. They understood the market, and Eric Yuan is someone who's very, very driven about building great products, and therefore he was able to build that, right? The founders of Pure Storage, there was 50 plus providers in the data infrastructure space. But guess what? They understood that there was a big market, number one, that it could be build a better product, number two, and they were going to basically go about doing that. One of the co-founders of Pure Storage wasn't even, this is his first job in storage, crying out loud. And he's just built one of the most iconic companies in the space, right? And so what I'm basically saying is there's going to be headwinds in your way. That's just part of the journey, and it's part of life that we have to face. But my advice is you have to be able to connect better collectively. And Buck Launch is a good platform for you to be able to do that, just one starting point. But you need to be able to be better connect to be able to figure this out. And I think that's very, very important.
I was just going to say big shout out to Ali and the Buck Launch team, because this is such a great example of community. And I think just to what you were saying as well, Boxon is such a relational market that building good relationships goes beyond these transactional things, right? These are long-term things that you're building over time. And just on the one of your points that you made about Zoom, when you spoke to our portfolio companies a couple of weeks ago, I took like 5 pages of notes. One of my favorite things that you said that I've now used as a quote multiple times, and I'm not just blowing hot air, right? I really mean this, is it's not just listening to what your users are saying, it's also listening to what they're not saying. And I think that to me was like such an important like golden nugget that I've taken away from that talk. So
thank you for that. Yeah, the point I was making there, sorry, but the point I'm basically making is you've got to be very customer centric. If you are a startup in Pakistan, you ultimately need to be able to build a product that people are willing to pay for and build to use. I know it sounds so basic, but you have to understand that's when you know you're either too early for market when people aren't basically doing it, or you haven't told the story and you haven't built a compelling use case, but you're ultimately building for a space where you haven't been able to, where people want to buy that product. I'll give you a very clear example. Alan Mulally, who used to be the CEO of Ford Motor Company, left 32 years, he spent 32 years at Boeing. And he took the CEO job at Ford in the height of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And, when everything was well and done, he turned the company around and bought it back from the brink and all the other things. People said, what happened? He was being interviewed, etc. And he basically said, well, we were building cars that nobody wanted to buy. Pretty straightforward and simple, right? And so if you go back to core principles, ultimately you basically figure out, you say, okay, where are people heading towards? What people want? How do I basically go about doing that? So that's one.
Yeah. And it's also so much too, I've been thinking about this a lot with one of our companies that we're working, that we've invested in. It's also sometimes people may not realize that your specific product is what they want, but there's sometimes an underlying aspiration behind it. And if you can get to the underlying aspiration, you can build a really great product that people want, right? And I think that's so important. We have so many great questions in here, so I'm going to get to everybody. One great question from Craig says, when seed funding is provided, what is the first thing you would advise to do with that money?
First thing advice, say thank you. So that's good, because I think that's important. People don't say thank you enough. You should do that. More about the partnership in all seriousness. I think the first thing is really depends on kind of what the biggest need is. Probably the most common piece is being able to get the right people in place. I always find that most startups have got a gap in management that they haven't realized, and they haven't basically figured out what they need. And so, you kind of need to be able to focus on kind of the management gap. Hiring is really hard. Talent acquisition, retention, getting the right people is really, really, really hard. Even in the Bay Area, forget about Pakistan and anywhere else. It's actually very, very hard. So my advice there is very simple. Focus on what you need from a key hiring standpoint and go after that very, very, very quickly. So that would be probably advice, my first piece of advice on receiving funding. Yeah.
Awesome. Haroon has a great question. We were talking about privacy and obviously the future of remote work. He was asking a question about the future of privacy in consumer space, given how Facebook, I think that's Facebook Good and APPL are taking positions on opposite side of the spectrum. What do you think the future of privacy looks like?
So I think, look, I'll say this I'm a monumental nerd, okay, and I actually have followed the privacy space a little bit more than I would like to admit to. There are about 1,500 companies in the private data privacy space, by the way. It's not actually a new thing. Data Protection Act in the UK from 1998 had driven a whole bunch of work around data privacy software solutions in place. Here's what's happening in the market. We're an investor in a company called InCountry, run by Peter Yarrad. And so I spent some time looking at the space for the last several years. The harsh reality is that data has now become a major asset for every country. You want to basically make sure, because ultimately, citizens, it is a human right in a lot of cases, but it also means that it's a huge asset for companies to be able to figure out how they sell products, how they're able to market, and all the other things that go with that. And people have understood that. So there's going to be more data regulation that's going on in the world, and there's going to be more data enforcement that's going on in the world. So there's multiple laws being signed and have been signed over the several years that have basically allowed that from. In Russia, it was FPZ, 2002. In India, it's basically been, another regulation. Yes, GDPR in the US, in Europe, which came about, CCPA in California. China also has that's always had a data residency issue, et cetera. So I think the key thing is that there's going to be more data enforcement and there's going to be more data regulation. So from a consumer privacy standpoint, I think that it's not going to slow down anytime soon. It is going to be country by country. That's one aspect of it. The harsh reality is that it's a prohibitor for a bunch of companies to do well. It's just some companies are not very well set up for it, but it's a huge opportunity from a startup standpoint, because I still think it's a very, very huge market. So privacy management in terms of software in privacy management in companies, for example, the reason for this is, again, Kalsoom, is very simple. Nobody wants to own it, right? If you think about it, you can hire, IT professionals and HR and finance, et cetera. It's very difficult to hire people who've got privacy experience, number one. It's actually really hard to find people who are passionate about privacy, right? And actually compliance. It's actually very hard to be able to do that. So, and those functions are not very mature in most companies. And so the way that problem is going to be solved is through software. There's a reason why OneTrust has the valuation it does, is because it was able to establish itself as a good workflow solution for data subject requests and DSRs coming into the enterprise, right? And be able to connect those up. And so that's important for, so the space I continue to basically believe in. I think more countries are going to probably do more enforcement than before. And not every company can afford to pay those fines. It's not easy to do. Right. And so I think as a result of that, you're going to start to see there's much bigger opportunity for software solutions to be built to address this need, basically.
Very cool. Sorry, and apologies. I was this was misspelled, and so I didn't know what I was reading, but it was Facebook, Google, and Apple is what they were referring to, which you answered really beautifully. So thank you for that. Okay, someone, Kulam says, as you mentioned, building the right partnerships is really important. If a startup founder wants to solve a core problem in an area which they haven't worked before, how do they connect with that community and learn and understand that area?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I just want to make sure.
Yeah. So basically, if a startup founder wants to solve a problem in an area that they may not have experience in, how do you recommend they actually build a network or connect with that community and learn and understand an area that they may not have previous experience in?
Right. Yeah. Very, very good question. So number one, the way you should basically approach that is find out who are the most influential people from a customer vantage point in that industry. You'll basically start to see CIOs who speak about it, if it's enterprise, maybe chief security officers, whatever it is. Like, find out who those influencers are. And influence, by the way, it's technology. It's not like some consumer fashion thing. This is software.
But they probably have a big Twitter following, at least.
I mean, I don't want to brag. Yeah. So go, try and reach out and connect to people from that vantage point, number one. Number two, you have to do the ground research. And that basically means you need to basically do a number of phone calls and to be able to understand and have a degree of conviction towards it, right? So actually, I think Craig, who asked a question, he's got startup DNA. I've met him a couple of times. And one of the things that he was able to basically do is to effectively understand sort of the DevOps space very, very well and has built a career around it. And so I learned from him, for example, when I was looking at DevOps companies, I'd be like, hey, Craig, could you give me some guidance? He said, well, here's how you would sell this. Here's how you would go that. Here, that. So not just being able to speak to C-level people, but speak to people who've been active in a particular space where you say, listen, I'm trying to basically think about this space. I want to be able to go after it. Can I be able to do it? So ground research around that is very important. You need to articulate that when you go to investors. It's, certain spaces are easier than others, right? And so that's, for example, cybersecurity, it's really hard to kind of move into it if you haven't had either a background or some degree of experience into it, because there's just so much, it's moving so fast. There's so much depth that goes into it. It's actually hard to be able to do it. So you have to have conviction. That I use the word conviction very deliberately, because that's the other pieces. Look at an industry, look at the people who are there, understand the customer problem and focus the customer problem. You're going to get a diversity of opinion. People from Fortune 500 companies, we have all of these problems. Not everybody operates as a Fortune 500 company. Like the number suggests, there's only 500 of them. So they don't all use a particular type of software. That's not the large majority of companies. So you get a diversity of opinion, you start to filter that out, and then you're able to address that from a market sizing standpoint. And then the other key piece is you need to ask yourself, why now? When you look at a solution and you understand it, investors saying, why are you building this now? Why is this an opportunity now? And there's lots of good questions for that. And I think that's what you should do. Lots of companies have been built where the founder has spent time. It's literally the 7th or 8th company in that space. And you look at it, you're like, well, isn't this space crowded? What are you guys doing, right? And when you speak to the founder, I can't name the company, but the founder has basically said, I spent all my time before I started this company speaking to the founders of the previous companies that were built in the space. And I found out why they failed. And so therefore, I basically built the product this way. And that's huge, huge validation, right? It just, it's immense. And so that basically helps a lot from that vantage point. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to even add off and just riff off of that, because I think it was so great what you just said. It's also, besides why now, it's also why me or why us, right? Which I think really comes from figuring out why you're unique and different. So even if you don't have the experience in the space, you probably bring a unique lens to it that maybe other people don't. And I was just thinking when you were speaking that, because Mispa and I are first-time fund managers, but obviously know the box on startup market super, super well. But what we did for the first, I mean, even now we're doing this, we literally just collected people that we saw as like experts that we really admired in VC and who were operators and people that we just were like, we loved their perspective and we just sat and learned from them. And I like literally show up to meetings with like notes and notes and notes of research that I've done on the person or the fund. And so is Mispa. And we just ask a ton of questions. And so I think giving your space to ask a lot of dumb questions is the best thing to do in the beginning part of that discovery process.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the thing is ultimately you're going with conviction. Right? You've understood that there's a space in this market. You've done the work around it. You've understood people in there. You've basically made inroads, all of those sort of things that basically happen. I think that's really, really important. One thing to understand, by the way, that's why I encourage startups all the time. People are like, oh, is the timing now? Can't somebody else already do this? Can't Amazon fix this, et cetera, et cetera. You hear this all the time. There's just a lot of companies that don't do well from a long-term standpoint as a product. Some products just don't last, right? They don't innovate fast enough. Right? They don't meet customer need. In some cases, the question about privacy, for example, the architecture of some of those solutions is not right. It doesn't scale. It hasn't been built for, say, a cloud native world in some cases, right? So the harsh reality is when you say why now, it's not just about the market need. It's absolutely fair. And you you are in your right to say those products, I can build a better product than that. The software industry by nature is imperfect. It's literally supposed to improve every single day, right? And hopefully, if you're improving it in a way that basically builds a product around the company, even better. So I would not basically hesitate to say, well, why now? And the team's proud or whatever. If you honestly believe that you're building a broader product that will sit, customers will draw themselves towards you, absolutely. There's no shortage of service now. Do you think anybody wanted to rip out an IT service desk in late 2000s? Like, do you think that's a project that a CIO actually wants to do? Of course not. But guess what? They were using it in lots of traditional solutions. ServiceNow came along and said, cloud first, basically a SaaS-based, SaaS-based service for IT, but also collected with other business functions. This is the future of service management. That's what we want to be able to go towards. Do you think we required AI and IT support when Moveworks came along? No. They basically decided that they looked at 70 millions of tickets, understood that there were patterns, that things could be repetitively resolved through AI. The timing was right with AI in terms of the models being available, the algorithms being available, the resource, the imagination. And they built a great company around it. I was lucky to be the first customer of that company, but I wasn't going out in the market saying, can I look for an AI solution which could solve IT support? No, I came on that, but basically there was a problem in this industry and you have to wait. So my big advice to founders is tell the story about why you're building the company. Tell the story about the problem you're trying to basically solve, right? Tell the story about how this is a long-term company. That all of those three things have to be consistent to speak with investors and with customers. Most people forget customers are investors as well. They are investing in you at an early stage as a customer. They are taking a risk. In fact, in some cases, they're taking a bigger risk than a bunch of VCs, right? Because their reputation is on the line. They deploy out the solution, it doesn't work. It really affects them. So you have to be very, very articulate and clear about that. And you should have to practice that. Most founders don't take enough time. So that would be my strong advice there.
It's so interesting because I was just reflecting on this the other day. There's such a pattern recognition that's happening in emerging markets of things that we've seen work in India and Indonesia. That's when often, in the Middle East, right? We'll see people just have those models in Pakistan, but it has to be so localized for our market. And I used to think that, okay, pattern recognition is great. It's, maybe not, it's not brand new, the idea, but it's new for Pakistan. But one thing that we were thinking about a lot recently, I was like, just because it worked in India and Indonesia, maybe we should also look at why it didn't work or why it's not working as well as it should, right? And how can we innovate and be even better for the Pakistan market and use the fact that we're behind those markets as our advantage rather than using it as a crutch and seeing it from an angle of disadvantage.
Yeah, look, I think it's very important that people understand. I have now completely dismissed the notion that, well, from my standpoint, like we're behind on one area or we want to be able to focus better on others. Like I have actually moved away from that from my standpoint. I say that with respect. And the reason is very simple. Every market is now completely different and has a catering of serving their customers in a very, very different way. Do we really think that a e-commerce company like Coupang in South Korea was a multi-billion-dollar company? Like, do we really believe that market is that? I mean, the harsh reality, they built a product over the course of time that served that customer base, and they just dominated it, and they did really, really well, right? And so I ultimately believe that, yes, there's reference points in that. For example, Europe, there's dozens of languages. So yeah, you may have the infrastructure in place in building a European business because you're part of the European Union, but you got to convert your website into multiple languages. And then you've got to have people who support those multiple languages.
Exactly.
Right? And then you've got to serve them and you've got to figure out logistics and all the things that basically go with that. That's just ultimately what happens. Yes, it's connected, but it's also disconnected in many, many ways, right? And so my viewpoint is that if you're building a startup in Pakistan, you understand a fundamental market need and you want to build a sizable company towards that. And I honestly think we compete in what I can call the experience economy. Ultimately, then customer experiences are driving products than ever before. Probably just more forgiving if you think about it. You're just more like, you're impatient. You want to be able to make sure that you get gratification from the product that you're using. You want to be able to do that. And so I think if companies focus on great customer experience, that is a good way to anchor how you basically build a company. And that ultimately means that you can do that in the market that you're operating in, right? And yes, it will take time, but Islamabad, Karachi, Lahore, those urban areas, but also others like the country is growing. There's more similarity and connectedness because technology enabled that across the board. And so don't discount that factor. Serve that need, and I think everything else will take care of itself. The last thing I would say to that is there've been a ton of these businesses which are not technology built, which were built for the Pakistan market, and they're very, very successful.
Totally.
So we've seen that.
Tech isn't always a solution.
Yeah.
We have so many great questions in here, which means that you're doing a really great job, Yousuf, because people are excited. Aisha's asking, could you share your experience about how new startups working in the data security solution space are able to build credibility? Typically, an organization investing in securing their data wants to go with a tested and tried vendor solution. So how do you build credibility as a new player?
Yeah. Strongest advice, architecture. Honestly, it just comes down to that from my vantage point. I'm being very simplistic about it. If you want to basically make a compelling need, most companies have basically bought a solution which is reference point solving towards the data security problem. The harsh reality is the application base that you will typically have in a company will basically expand and become more complex over time, right? You will have everything from a hybrid cloud situation that you put into place. You'll probably be deploying more services into not just single cloud, but multiple clouds. You're building in more SaaS solutions. And ultimately, if you're going to build a data security solution, you need to be able to make sure that the architecture around it is able to scale, number one. Number two, is able to integrate very, very well. And number three, is actually right fit from a from a customer usage standpoint. There's a number of these solutions that are basically built, which only are built for a very small subset of, say, the security team. The harsh reality is data security is actually, and compliance is actually a very, very wide issue. And so a lot of solutions fail as a result of not having the right architecture or not a good user experience that comes in place. A lot of companies in general, not just in the data security space, but others, are ultimately come down to user experience. The lack of being able to integrate with certain solutions, the ability to have yet another dashboard to look at, the lack of integration with, say, messaging or collaboration, the lack of workflow. Workflow is probably one of the things that I focus very heavily on, because I think the more operationally efficient you can make a data security team, the better it is, and hopefully being able to do that. So that's why I would advise.
Awesome. We had a question from a lot earlier from Nabil who asked, and this is from your perspective of what you're seeing, and obviously Ridge is open to investing in Pakistan, but how comfortable are US VCs? How comfortable are they getting at investing in tech startups coming out of Pakistan from your perspective? And I'm also happy to share mine too.
So look, unfair advantage at Ridge, because you got a Pakistani as a partner. So
yeah, that's always a secret weapon, right? I always notice there's a Pakistani at a VC, and that's why they look at Pakistan.
Yeah, let's agree that we actually want a lot of non-Pakistanis to invest in Pakistan rather than just Pakistanis to invest in Pakistan. Totally. So that's the long-term goal. So we'll basically try and make that happen in some way, shape, or form. Look, I think the thing is that we've got to tell the stories better. That's a big part of it. And so the more we can basically do that, a lot of countries have ultimately done a much better way of showcasing it. And I think that's a marketing thing that needs to be done by combination of government, private sector, or otherwise. Like, we just have to spend time doing that. Like, there's a lot of education that needs to be done from that vantage point. Number two, we've got to basically be able to tell the stories of successful companies that come out of it. My viewpoint is very simple. The companies that I've spoken with over time, thanks to introductions from yourself, Kalsoom, the technical advantage and experience is best in class. It really is, right? And I say that with a sense of pride, not with a sense of bias. I've been an operator for 20 years. Like, some of the things that we've been talking about, you're like, wow, you're doing that. And it's like so matter of fact, like, oh yeah, we've been doing that. So I think there's good DNA. I think that needs to be packaged with good success stories, right? I think the other piece is, yes, we need to be able to educate on the market opportunity, which hasn't been done very, very well, right? And so that's why it's absolutely fine if you're investing in a startup which is catering to the Pakistan market. But what does that market actually look like, right? And so hopefully, my viewpoint is, when we travel again, that we're able to basically do that. So yeah, over a decade plus ago, I was actually trying to invest in startups in Pakistan. I actually was raising a fund, both much more kind of more mid-market versus startup-wise. I was investing in businesses there to be able to do joint ventures with companies in the UK. That was one of the things I was trying to basically do. And the harsh reality was it was an education piece that I was not able to do. Huge. And so when I did the roadshow, I spent time out of my own money to be able to bring some people. They were like, whoa, like, we did not, this is amazing, right? And so that showcasing is a big part of our journey, and we collectively need to be able to do that, both online and then sort of in person. So I think that's the big advice I would basically give. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that I would just add to that is that I think that, for us we built a research arm at Eye about 5 years ago now, and mainly from the angle of saying that, the warm and fuzzy stories about Pakistan are great, but they're just not going to work in a long-term sustainable way of how we tell a better story about the market, right? So for us, telling a research-driven story about what's happening on the ground in the market is the most powerful way we can get people to invest. And I think what we've noticed, at least in the last 2 deals that we've done, it's been 2-to-1 international to local investors. And I think it's also depending on the sector. So this is where the pattern recognition comes in. I've noticed that international investors are much more likely to invest in a company in Pakistan if they've maybe done a similar investment in Indonesia or Mexico, or even in the Bay Area, right? Like, they know that, because then it's the market risk is still there, but at least they understand the business itself. And so that's what I've noticed is the easiest ones where investor retention is almost like international investors. It's crazy how many are so excited about Pakistan. I think a lot of people are seeing it as kind of one of the last untapped emerging markets where the valuations maybe aren't as high on an average basis comparatively to India, of course, and then obviously Indonesia and even the Middle East right now. So definitely seeing a lot.
One final thing I would say on that, Kalsoom, is we need, the quickest thing to do that is to basically build as much track record of engineering, kind of expertise as much as possible. There's a number of companies, Spec It, for example, with Zari, calculations to her on our fundraise recently, right? So I met that team. They're brilliant, right? And so I think, companies which have built good engineering, and if we can do what we can to be able to encourage that and actually build that basically means that building a nice engineering hub gives a lot of credibility in the technology ecosystem, right? Being able to showcase that, being able to actually talk about it, being able to tell the stories where it's a natural piece of companies building an engineering center there is absolutely valid. There's no reason why they should build it in Mexico or any other place. They should actually build it in Pakistan. India is actually exceptionally crowded. The talent acquisition is now kind of saturated from all intents and purposes. So we have an opportunity from our standpoint to be able to basically build that. And so as part of your story, if you're a startup, being able to say, look, we have a solid engineering team where we've been able to acquire and actually build this out. And as you get investment from yourselves, I think that's absolutely huge. So yeah, that would be great.
Mindful of time, so we'll take one more question and then we're going to end on a good call to action for everyone. So
sure.
This was asked earlier in terms of intellectual property, which I thought was quite interesting. For a startup in the early formulation stages, how do you protect your intellectual property, specifically, especially in the Pakistani ecosystem where you want to collaborate and share ideas while you're incubating, but at the same time, how do you protect your idea? What would you advise people?
This may be very, very controversial.
Okay.
I'll say it this way. Don't spend too much time on it. Honestly, look, it's actually very, very difficult to do. Number one. It's very difficult to defend. Like, it just is, right? To what extent that you want to be able to do it. Ultimately, what you can protect is the customer experience. That's yours to own, actually. That's what ultimately drives all of it. You can build all the best technology all you want, and somebody else, a competitor, can build a better technology. But if you have a better customer experience, you'll win every single time. I guarantee that, right? Yeah. So I don't think you should be spending time on it at all, actually, because candidly speaking, technology is moving so quickly from that van. If you have some monumental secret sauce about a particular algorithm or something like that, that's fine. But it's actually really difficult to replicate things from my vantage point. It doesn't typically work. In the long haul, because there's much more that goes into a startup than just intellectual property. It's the people behind it, it's how you sell, it's how you package it. All of those things sort of come into place. And so I would argue that it is not the best use of resources at this stage to be able to do it. You should be focusing on building a product. You should be focusing time on acquiring customers, taking it to market, and basically raising money and being able to basically make sure you build a business. Your product is going to evolve over time. It's going to change. Your business is going to evolve over time. What's the point of trying to protect something which is not going to matter in the space of a year, if not 18 months? I don't see that as a good way of doing it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think even unpacking, having the best customer experience, to what you've been saying earlier, having the best customer experience is also knowing your customers better than your competitors do, right? It's speaking to them on a regular basis. It's getting their feedback and building that loop. And that's ultimately how you'll outcompete, not necessarily because of IP, right? Or because of you've spent the time to do that. So I would agree with that as well.
Yeah, it applies to maybe some very specific sectors, I'm sure, like, specific types of hardware or something like that. But, the biggest scheme of things, software and technology evolves so quickly. Really see that as a good use of time for a startup founder. That is not a good use of time.
Totally. So we are at the hour. So what I would love for you to leave us with today, so many great nuggets of wisdom as always, Yousuf. Give us a great call to action. What is something that all of us, a great piece of advice or something for all of us to leave today on a Sunday as we chew on for the rest of the week? What would you leave us with?
Okay. Well, I think a couple of things. I haven't thought about this actually, but I'll tell you straight from the heart. Actually, I think you just have to keep moving forward. I think that's probably the biggest call to action. You have to be able to move things further forward. Number one. Number two, probably the biggest call of action is look at the people around you and see who can basically help. I've accepted pretty much every LinkedIn invite before this event happened, and I will accept everyone that comes after it. I won't be able to help every single one of them, But the harsh reality is, if I can help even 10% where I can connect up somewhere other, I'll probably going to basically do that. So that's important. Number three, you can't accept failure from a starting vantage point. The line of progress is not drawn straight, as Barack Obama once basically said. You have to understand that there's going to basically be shifts and tangents that you have to go towards. But if you build a singular goal, my ultimate belief is that you're going to basically go after that. Number four, you have to be creative as you understand that. So I think the thing that hasn't happened in the ecosystem, and I'll say this right now, the biggest call to action is increase the level of partnership and collaboration. You'd be very, very surprised how two companies or two sets of founders or two groups of teams say, you know what, we've got immensely good, talented people. We think along the same lines. We think we've got a good product out. Let's go after this together. It's great to have lots of companies. There's no denying that. But we have to remember that this industry is being built at the early stages of where we are. I think the combination of being able to build that ecosystem and strengthening it is what's going to basically differentiate us. So the biggest call to action is from that vantage point. Inshallah, my biggest plan for 2021, 2022 is to make more regular visits to Pakistan. I haven't done it in quite some time. So I'm already working on the logistics towards doing that. And so I really hope that I will get to connect with people and be able to help from that standpoint. But that level of connectedness is absolutely important. Do not be afraid to ask for help. Like, it's the worst thing that something is going to happen is someone is going to say no. Like, it's okay. Someone will say yes, and they'll sort of take it from there. It's absolutely fine for you to do so. But think about the road ahead and just keep charging ahead towards it. That's my biggest call to action.
I completely agree with that. That was great. Thank you so much for such a great session. Thank you to Ali and the Bach Launch team, as always, for this great platform that you've created in this great community. And thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And I really appreciate it. Ali, you're grossly underpaid for all of this. So I have nothing but more respect and appreciate
we need to build a strategy for you, Ali. We'll do that next.
Yeah, we're building some Amazon gift cards as we speak. So they will be funded as a result, and coincidence for that. But yeah, look, thank you again. And as always, I'm here to help how which way I can. And Kalsoom, thank you. And Misbah also, you're doing amazing work. I look forward for us doing a deal together eventually. That should be a lot of fun.
Hopefully. Great. Thank you guys so much. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.